Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Through executive orders, Joe Biden stopped construction of the border wall, ended Trump's Wait in Mexico policy, and announced that our borders are wide open to illegal crossings. What is the Democrats' goal here? And why is the law being so flagrantly violated? Not just by the migrants, but by the U.S. government. With me to discuss that on today's program is Dave Ray, the communications director of FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. Dave, welcome to the Mike Bates Show.
Hey, Mike, good to be with you, my friend. I'll tell you, you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, Joe Biden, during the Democratic debates, announced to the world that if he was elected, he was going to dismantle the most effective immigration deterrent system the nation has seen in decades. It was constructed by President Donald Trump, that he was going to cancel agreements with our neighbors to the south. He was going to reinstate catch and release. He was going to stop building the border wall. And then perhaps most importantly, he was going to push for an amnesty for the nation's 14 million illegal aliens. You fast forward a few months later, he's in the third month of his presidency. They are anticipating the largest wave of illegal immigration this nation has seen in more than 2 decades. And the president seems a little bit surprised. I mean, in a recent interview with George Stephanopoulos said, Mr. President, these people are saying you invited them. And that is the perception. What they believe is that the United States has dismantled its ability to control any kind of influx. And so anyone and everyone who ever thought that they might want to illegally enter the country, now is the time to come. Because on top of easy access to the United States, there's also the idea of the amnesty down the pipeline. He's created a real crisis for the nation and for himself, Mike. I mean, he did not have to do this. He inherited a country that already had a dual crisis going on. We have the COVID health crisis, and we have the economic crisis caused by COVID. And now he has created a third one for us. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, and it's not just perception, it is reality. He has dismantled it, and the illegal migrants know it. So let me begin with this question for you, Dave. Has Joe Biden dismantled President Trump's immigration and border control policies just because he hates Trump? Or do Democrats actually want unlimited illegal immigrants coming into this country?
Well, I think it's both of those. I think that Joe Biden sees anything and everything that was done by Donald Trump as being inherently evil, and that he was going to appease the left side of his political party, was going to undo everything that President Trump had done. Although, if you realize in the election year 2020, immigration wasn't even an issue of conversation because the border was so effectively sealed that there wasn't anything to talk about. So he's dismantled those policies. But then I do believe that Democrats see mass immigration, mass uncontrolled immigration, as having a positive political impact for them. There's been studies before, and particularly when you're dealing with poverty-stricken illegal aliens, that when they become citizens, they register Democrat to Republican about 65% of the time. And so, this could be a quick way to turn Texas blue in the next decade, because, most of these folks are flooding into Texas. Democrats last week introduced a bill that would grant amnesty to the nation's 14.5 million illegal immigrants. And this is a situation that they've completely created on their own. And there's a lot of double talk, too. For example, on the wall, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have both condemned the border wall, calling it archaic or medieval. But you go to Nancy Pelosi's house outside of San Francisco, and what is it surrounded by? A wall. So the wall's good enough for her. It's just not good enough to protect us.
Well, if it wasn't for double standards, the Democrats would have no standards at all. So that doesn't surprise me. You mentioned something, though, about during the Trump presidency that the border was effectively closed. I do want to add to that, though, because I think this is a critical point. It wasn't just that the border was effectively closed to illegal immigration. It was that the illegal immigrants knew to not even try
Right.
Now, that's not to say that nobody crossed. I mean, clearly people did. But
Hmm.
by having those policies in effect, it reduced the number of people attempting it. So anyone who wants to say, oh, well, we should be a humanitarian country and we're avoiding a humanitarian crisis. Well, isn't the best way, Dave, to avoid a humanitarian crisis at the border is to not invite people into a situation that's going to put them into a humanitarian crisis?
Right. Everything that we've talked about, Mike, whether you're talking about the border wall, you're talking about the Remain in Mexico policy that ended catch and release, you're talking about interior enforcement by immigration and customs enforcement, you're talking about these multilateral agreements that we had with our neighbors to the south that said if somebody's seeking asylum, let's say they're from Honduras, the first country they step into, it would be Guatemala, that they have to ask for asylum there. All of these things taken together kind of as a portfolio approach to stopping illegal immigration, their biggest value is deterrent. Illegal aliens, just like you and I, are rational individuals, and they're willing to take chances and to do things when they think they're going to get away with it. And they now think that they're not only capable of getting into the United States, they're possibly going to be put on a pathway to citizenship. Unfortunately, it's kind of a bad news, good news thing. The good news is that the president finally realizes that there's a crisis at the border. The bad news is that it's the president of Mexico who realizes that we have a crisis at the border. In fact, last week, AMLO, Lopez Obrador, said, quote, we need to work together to regulate the flow because this business can't be tackled from one day to the next. And what has happened here, and this is really something that hasn't been talked about by the media at all, is that this massive influx of people into Mexico from all around the world, we're not just talking Central America, we have people from terror hotspots that have been apprehended, Iran, Yemen, Syria, China. Border Patrol will tell you when you're standing on the border that nobody crosses the border illegally from Mexico into the United States without the cartels being paid. What is happening is that we are talking about 6,000 people a day trying to cross the border. The cartel's making money off of every single one of those crossings. And that in and of itself is going to be very, very destabilizing to the government of Mexico, which is always having trouble with the cartels. So not only is this going to destabilize the United States because our economy is in shambles and destabilize the United States because of a public health crisis? This is going to destabilize our immediate neighbor to the south, which is not good news for Mexico and not good news for the United States.
Right. And Mexico was perfectly okay with housing migrants in Mexico while they
Yes.
awaited asylum hearings. So why did Joe Biden change that and just let them into the United States to wait for those hearings here?
Donald Trump, and perhaps this was because he was a businessman and didn't think like a politician, when the numbers really started creeping up, the first thing he did, knowing that we are Mexico's best trading partner, we buy most of their goods, he said to them, if you don't regain control of your southern border to Mexico, we're going to put tariffs on everything you sell to the United States. And I'm telling you what, that caught their attention lickety split. They had federal troops down on their southern border, and this problem was brought to a very quick closure. In addition, though, Mexico also showed what a good partner it could be for the United States. It said to anybody who wanted to ask for asylum, who's coming in from Central America, ask for asylum in Mexico. We will give you work papers and you can work here in Mexico. The Remain in Mexico policy was really key because all of the coverage that you see about the children streaming into the United States, this is made possible by loopholes in our asylum laws because it's catch and release. People come in, they ask for political asylum. If you're an adult with a child with you, you can't be held by U.S. law for more than 20 days. So you have to be released into the interior of the country. This stopped catch and release in its tracks because it said you're going to wait in Mexico. There's a backlog in the asylum courts, maybe as long as a year. But when your case comes up, You will come into the United States, you will sit in front of an immigration judge, and you will describe to us how it is that you're being persecuted by your government and why you would qualify for asylum. It completely stopped catch and release, put an end to the unending stream of unaccompanied minors and adults who are simply looking to thumb their nose at our immigration laws, and brought the border under control. And that was one of the first things Joe Biden, he not only ended the agreement with Mexico, closed the camps, he then put those folks on buses, some of whom tested positive for COVID, and busted them all over the country.
I understand we're not even requiring that they be tested. A few of them have been. But if an American citizen comes back to the United States from abroad, he or she needs to be tested. But if somebody comes in illegally, they don't have to be? Isn't that kind of ridiculous?
No, the federal government is not testing anyone. And they're telling local communities, you can test if you want to, but then what are you going to do with these people? They're coming in, they don't have any identification. Most of them don't have a lot of money. If you do come up positive for COVID, are the communities supposed to house you for 14 days until you're through your symptoms? I mean, most of these border communities are fairly poor. That's why we have congressmen from along the U.S.-Mexico border and mayors screaming about this, because Biden has caused a real economic pinch in a part of the country that is already poverty-stricken before this even started.
We are speaking with Dave Ray. He's the communications director of FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. We've got to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. With me on the telephone is Dave Ray, the communications director of FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. You can find him at www.fairus.org. So, Dave, these people who are seeking asylum, are these legitimate asylum claims? It's my understanding that poverty and living in a dangerous neighborhood don't really constitute grounds for asylum. It doesn't have to be legit persecution of some sort?
Right. To answer your question, about 90% of these asylum cases will be denied. You have to prove that you are being selected out and persecuted by your government, or that your government is looking the other way while you're being persecuted based on your race, ethnicity, political beliefs, or other criteria. What we saw with catch and release is that these folks know how to game the system. You come in, the threshold of proving that you have credible fear when you meet with an immigration officer is so low that almost everyone qualifies. So once you qualify, you could be detained if you're an adult, theoretically, until your hearing comes up, but we really can't do that because we don't have that much detention space. But if you come in with a kid, then you're guaranteed that you can't even be detained for more than 20 days. They release you into the interior of the United States. As many as 40% of the people who place an asylum claim never even bother to fill out the application. So they weren't intending to do this in the first place. Another 31% never show up for their hearings. When it's all said and done, when you're talking about people from Central America, about 9% of them end up getting political asylum. That's a big problem. They've gimmicked the asylum system as a way to get into the United States. And, the asylum laws have been gimmicked for far too long. Asylum is an important thing. If you truly are fleeing your government and fleeing for your life, think about, Jews fleeing Nazi Germany. You would want a place for those people to be safe so the government couldn't persecute them, couldn't torture them and put them in prison forever. But that's not what we have here. These are economic migrants. They are coming for work. The thing that is the most telling, if you look at a map of Central America, if you're somebody who's coming from Honduras, which is the largest nation sending would-be asylees to the United States right now, and they're saying, I'm being persecuted by the government of Honduras. Well, what about when you step into Guatemala? Because you can't get to the United States without going through Guatemala. Are you being persecuted in Guatemala too? What about when you step into Mexico? Is the Mexican government also persecuting you? I mean, this is why their cases fall apart. And these were the agreements that President Trump had with these Central American partners is that you have to ask for asylum in the first safe nation where you land. We have a similar agreement with Canada, but what that means is that if you're from Honduras and you claim to be fleeing your government, when you get into Guatemala, you have to ask for asylum there because that government isn't persecuting you. And what that did was, along with the Remain in Mexico policy, just completely put an end to catch and release because people realized, I'm not going to be able to get away with it. I'm not going to waste my time.
And so what we have now is these people coming across the border because they know they're being welcomed with open arms. It's my understanding, Dave, that the people who have been waiting in Mexico under President Trump's policies are being accepted into the United States. Is that correct?
They are being brought into the United States, put on buses, and then we are going to watch them disappear into the fabric of society. Unfortunately, there was a report last week that 100 of them who were COVID positive and were sent to North Carolina. So when you hear about a fourth wave of COVID, you don't have to think too hard about where some of this fourth wave might be coming from. But yeah, the Remain in Mexico policy has been canceled. Biden's done everything but tear down the border wall. He has dismantled every meaningful facet of immigration enforcement that we have. And now he's surprised that the illegal aliens of the world are streaming to the United States. I mean, it wasn't but about 3 weeks ago that the top immigration enforcement officer in the United States, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, said to the world's illegal aliens, it's not that we don't want you to come, it's that we don't want you to come now. And this is the guy who's supposed to be the top immigration enforcement officer for the country. I mean, do you see the ludicrousy of this and how the cartels are telling people, pay $10,000, you get in the United States, you're going to get right in line for amnesty. The amnesty that the Democrats put forth, by the way, it's not for people who have long, deep roots in the United States who've been working here for 30 or 40 years and, have American children. People who arrived as recently as January 1st of this year would qualify for the amnesty put forth by the Democrats.
Yeah, it is just absolutely disgraceful how they are pursuing such a policy of ignoring American law, which I want to get into a little bit later on. But I want to clarify something you said a moment ago. I didn't want to interrupt you when you said it, but a few minutes ago, you said that 31% of people don't show up for the asylum hearings. I've heard it was more like 90 to 95. Is it really only 31% don't show up? That seems like a surprisingly small number.
Well, I mean, 40% don't even file the paperwork. So they're not even going to get an asylum hearing in the first place. Of those who file the paperwork, at least 31% of them don't even show up for the hearing. So when you take it all together, you've got 70% plus people who are just coming in and disappearing. And of those who do show up, most of them are told no because they're not legitimate asylees. They're if you've ever watched any of the news coverage of the caravans, of people coming up from the caravans, when they're asked by American journalists, why are you coming? They're very honest. We're coming for jobs. We need work. We want to work. That does not qualify you as an asylee. You are an economic migrant. And if you want to be an economic migrant, that's fine. But you need to get in line and to apply to become a legal immigrant, to wait your turn, to get your background check, to get your health exam, and then come to the United States legally, not by gimmicking our asylum laws.
Yeah, let's talk about doing things legally when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. I have with me on the telephone Dave Ray, the Communications Director of FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. So, Dave, Joe Biden has pretty much dismantled border security through executive orders. Now, executive orders are not in and of themselves unconstitutional. They can be a perfectly legitimate tool, but they cannot violate our Constitution. Well, if the president is constitutionally obligated to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and those are the exact words of Article 2, Section 3 in the Constitution, if he is obligated to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, but he has this open border that so clearly violates U.S. law. How can the administration simply choose to not only ignore the law, but to actively assist people in breaking the law?
Right. Well, there's unfortunately a lot of leeway given to the chief executive about how they go about enforcing laws and what emphasis they place on enforcement. One of his executive orders, which was so outrageous, it was to stop all deportations of illegal and criminal aliens for the next 100 days. These are people who had been through all the hearings, had been ordered deported from the country, and he wanted to halt their deportations.
But a judge did stop that, right?
A judge did stop that. But another example of how much leeway the executives have, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is the agency that handles interior enforcement of our immigration laws. President Biden has said to ICE, when you do your job, the only people you can remove are people who are here illegally and have committed some sort of heinous crime. So in other words, he has told them hands off basically on 90% of the illegal alien population in the US. That is just another incentive to try to come here. So he's taken Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and he's removed the E. There's no enforcement. So we're left with IC. You know, IC is not a very good thing to have in the United States. We need ICE because we need immigration enforcement. And now 90% of those who are here illegally know they're going to get a pass, even if they are apprehended by ICE.
Yeah, Dave, I want to push back on something that you just said, that the president has discretion in enforcing the laws. I understand the concept of prosecutorial discretion. I don't think this is a matter of that, however. Because this isn't simply saying, well, there's more important things we got to focus on. This is actively setting up a program to aid and abet the law breaking of these migrants. Is that not a difference?
I agree with you, Mike. This is Obama part 2. They are simply saying that I am, as the chief executive, I am going to detail to the government agencies how I want them to spend their time. I feel like it is turning a blind eye to U.S. law. I mean, just being in the country illegally is enough to be deported. You don't have to come in here and cut somebody's head off or burn somebody's house down on top of it. But, you know, we've seen this time and again where President Obama got away with it for 8 years. Now President Biden's doing it again. Turned a blind eye to illegal immigration unless these people have committed some grand offense on top of being here illegally. So, yeah, I mean, I wish there was some way to challenge that. Certainly, there are laws that can be passed by Congress, but honestly, we have a lot of good laws on the books if they would be enforced. The problem is that, except for Donald Trump, we have not had a president in recent years who's really been willing to fully enforce the nation's immigration laws.
Well, that's very true. And unfortunately, right now, we have a secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, who said, and this is a quote, "We are operating under a broken immigration system and we need to fix it." Well, okay. I'll actually agree with all that. We're operating under a broken immigration system, and we do need to fix it. The problem is neither DHS nor the administration is attempting to fix it under the law. They're simply openly violating the law.
Yeah, so here you have a man who works for Joe Biden, his top immigration enforcement official. The Democrats have a majority in the House, and they have a majority in the Senate. And his argument is we need to fix the law to take care of this. Well, you control both houses of Congress and the presidency. It seems like any opportunity you might want to take to fix the law should be initiated with you. The real fact is that Mayorkas has no interest in enforcing the law. In fact, when he was asked during his testimony, when he was testifying for his job, what he envisioned in terms of immigration enforcement, he was caught flat-footed. He hardly had anything to say. It was Senator Josh Hawley who asked him the question. He clearly, Mayorkas is the fellow who came up with DACA, which was the illegal Obama executive action that allowed people who were here illegally, who arrived before their 16th birthday, to have their deportation deferred and given work documents. So they are not legal immigrants. They're illegal aliens with work documents who can't be deported. This is Alejandro Mayorkas that was one of his brainchildren. So, this is the situation that we have now.
And that was such an illegal action by the administration, the DACA program. And
right.
For the record, I actually support the concept of granting legal status to what are referred to as the Dreamers. I don't necessarily think they ought to have citizenship, but I am in favor of granting them some legal status where they won't be deported. But it has to be done under the law. It cannot be done via executive action. And that's what happened under Obama. He asked Congress for the DREAM Act, and Congress said no. And so Obama said, well, I'm going to do it anyway through executive action. And much to our surprise, the courts did not stop it, claiming that it wasn't an illegal executive order because it was not Obama himself who did it. What kind of nonsensical decision-making is that by the court?
Well, I think if DACA gets back to the Supreme Court and they have a chance to make a decision on its merits, it will be struck down. There was a similar program under Obama that was called DAPA, and then that's the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans. In other words, these were illegal alien parents.
And that was determined to be unconstitutional.
That was struck down. So DACA will be struck down if it gets to the Supreme Court and they get a chance to make a decision on its merits. But, FAIR has never supported an amnesty because we believe it's bad public policy. And here's the problem with giving any kind of legal status to the Dreamers. If kids come into the country, parents bring their kids illegally into the country and get those kids on a pathway to citizenship. Once these kids are citizens, the first thing they're going to do is sponsor their illegal alien parents. And so it incentivizes people using their children as a get out of jail free card, if you will, to get your foot in the door in the United States. And that's why we've opposed the DREAM Act as well. But Americans are all over the board on this. But I think when you think about passing laws that deter people from breaking the law, then you're going to have an immigration system that actually works better for everyone who's trying to play by the rules.
Well, despite the courts doing their best to block President Trump for 4 years, his policies actually did have a very good effect at the border in that it dramatically reduced, it didn't stop, of course, but it dramatically reduced the number of illegal border crossings. And he managed to build 464 miles of border security fencing, not so much a wall, but fencing.
Right.
But Joe Biden, through executive order, said, stop. And they simply one day stopped to the point that where there were supposed to be gates, there's openings in the fencing for gates, but there aren't gates there yet. And instead of putting the gates in, they're just left wide open. It's mind baffling.
What's mind-boggling is that President Biden acts surprised that people are reacting to what he's done. There's no surprise here. It didn't take a crystal ball to tell you that if you announce to the world that you're going to remove every deterrent we have at the border, that all of a sudden you're going to have hordes of people rushing into the United States. Nobody should be surprised by this. Honestly, Joe Biden needs to get out of the White House basement and go down to the border and look at the mess that he's created.
Well, I don't anticipate that happening.
No.
So let's discuss real quick before you go the political agenda here. Is this just a matter of appealing to the leftist base of the Democrat Party, or are the Democrats truly pursuing turning not just Texas, but America blue via illegal immigration?
Well, I think if you look at what Donald Trump did to the Democratic Party and how he was able to start siphoning off a lot of your working class, Black, Latino, and white working class voters, the Democrats see immigration as a way of building their numbers because they know about 65% of these people, most of whom are desperately poor, are going to need the social programs that the Democrats love offering, and they are going to register Democrat and vote Democrat. And I do believe that there is a political calculation in here about turning Texas blue, and there's an appeasement to the left wing of the Democratic Party. And I think both of these things are in play right now.
But do not the blue-collar Democrat supporters, voters I'm talking about, do they not realize that when an illegal immigrant comes across the border planning to work, that the jobs they're taking are not from the bank presidents or the CEOs? What they're taking are the blue-collar jobs, roofers, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, auto mechanics, etc. Is the Democrat policy not taking jobs away from the very Americans they claim to be such big supporters of? Is the working man?
They absolutely don't seem to understand that, which is why Donald Trump did so phenomenally well among Black and white and Hispanic working class folks who saw their wages actually going up as the immigration policies tightened the border. The Democrats don't seem to understand that for every illegal alien who comes into the country, there's an American victim. And that victim, I mean, I'm not talking about people whose children are killed by illegal immigrants, but I'm talking about in the workplace. Mm-hmm. It drives down wages and working conditions for people who are here legally and displaces them from the workplace. And that's the one thing that the Democrats don't seem to get. But I'll tell you what, a lot of people did get it. I mean, the support for Donald Trump in heavily Hispanic border counties in Texas was higher than any Republican has ever had. And he did better among Hispanics and Blacks than any Republican has done in recent memory. And it's because people understood their wages were going up, their jobs weren't being threatened, and they were bringing more money home for their kids.
And unfortunately, the entire agenda is being bracketed by the dishonest propaganda press as being racist, that this is all between white people and Hispanic people, when in reality, it's between legal people and illegal people. And the problem that people have isn't that they're Hispanic. If they were coming across the border legally, I think people would welcome them with open arms. It's the illegal aspect that people object to, is it not?
It absolutely is. And it's the aspect that we don't know who's coming over the border. We are a nation that has a lot of enemies, and there are a lot of terrorism threats out there, active terrorists who are trying to do bad to the United States. We should have learned that lesson on 9/11. We seem to have forgotten it, unfortunately. But with that said, this is not about race, ethnicity. The United States has always been welcoming of legal immigrants. It will continue to be, but they want them to come through the proper channels. I mean, FAIR has 3 million members and supporters across the country. Many of them are legal immigrants. People who've been through the process understand its importance, its need for the country, and why all immigration should be legal immigration.
Precisely. Dave Ray, Communications Director of FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Mike Bates Show. If people want to learn more, it's www.fairus.org, right?
That's right, Mike. Or check us out on Facebook at Federation for American Immigration Reform, or on Twitter at #FairImmigration. Thanks so much, Mike, and hope to come back and chat with you again soon, my friend.
We will definitely do that, Dave. We got one more segment of this program, which I will cover, give you a few thoughts of my own, when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. As Dave Ray and I both said in the last segment, Barack Obama's creation of the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was blatantly unconstitutional. Says me? Says Dave Ray? Says President Obama. It was very unusual for Barack Obama to ever tell the truth about anything. But in a rare moment, he was truthful at a Univision TV town hall meeting in March of 2011 when he responded to a question about why he wouldn't just allow illegal immigrants to stay in America with temporary protective status or by simply suspending deportations. This is the question and the answer from that town hall.
Mr. President, my question will be as follows. With an executive order, could you be able to stop deportations of the students? And if that's so, that links to another of the questions that we have received through Univision.com. We have received hundreds, thousands, all related to immigration and their students. Jay Tamar, through Univision.com, told us, I'm reading, what if at least you grant temporary protected status, TPS, to undocumented students? If your answer is yes, when? And if it's no, why not?
Well, first of all, temporary protective status historically has been used for special circumstances where you have immigrants to this country who are fleeing persecution in their countries, or there's some emergency situation in their native land that required them to come to the United States. So it would not be appropriate to use that just for a particular group that came here primarily, for example, because they were looking for economic opportunity. With respect to the notion that I can just suspend deportations through executive order, that's just not the case, because there are laws on the books that Congress has passed, and I know that everybody here at Bell is studying hard, so you know that we've got 3 branches of government. Congress passes the law. The executive branch's job is to enforce and implement those laws, and then the judiciary has to interpret the laws. There are enough laws on the books by Congress that are very clear in terms of how we have to enforce our immigration system, that for me to simply, through executive order, ignore those congressional mandates would not conform with my appropriate role as president.
So it's very clear from that Barack Obama can't claim that he thought his DACA program was legal, because he had previously acknowledged that it would be unconstitutional. He originally sought to implement DACA via the DREAM Act, but when Congress rejected it, he simply unilaterally imposed it, even though he'd previously said he didn't have the authority to. Now, I do want to quickly explain why I would like to see the Dreamers granted legal status in the United States via a congressional action. Because I'm known as kind of a law and order guy, I know it surprised a lot of you to hear that I favor the legalization of the Dreamers. So let me explain why. And first, let me say this. If we actually were going to deport the Dreamers, then I would say, sure, deport the Dreamers. They're here illegally. They ought to be kicked out of the country. But we all know we're not going to ever deport the Dreamers. They're going to stay here for as long as they want to, probably the rest of their lives. So if they are going to stay here, we ought to have them here legally under some system created not by executive action, but by Congress through the constitutional legislative process. And this is the basis for my belief. There are 2 concepts already existing in law that have nothing to do with immigration. This is more of a real estate issue. And the 2 concepts are squatters' rights and adverse possession. Squatters' rights is when you occupy someone else's property without permission for a continuous period of time. If you do it long enough, and every state has its own definition of what's considered to be long enough, but if you occupy someone else's property long enough, you actually gain squatters' rights, and they lose the ability to simply kick you off the land. Similarly, there's another concept in real estate called adverse possession. And adverse possession is when somebody illegally, continuously, and obviously possesses your property and you do nothing about it. They can eventually come to own your property. They don't have to pay you for it. You can prove that they were there illegally. But if you did nothing about it over a certain period of time, and again, every state has its own definition of what that period of time is, that person who was illegally using your property can actually come to own your property through adverse possession. And that's kind of how I feel about these Dreamers. There are 825,000 people who participated in DACA. Although the total number of people who came to the United States illegally when they were children as they accompanied their parents across the border could be as high as 4 million. Nobody really knows. But we knew they were here. And we did nothing for a period of 20 years at least? Probably really more than that. But at least 20 years. And I just think that it is inappropriate to deport some 20-year-old who arrived in America when he was 2. And America's all he knows. And we made no effort to kick him out. in the previous 18 years. It's not a perfect analogy, I know, but if you investigate the concept of squatters' rights, and if you investigate the concept of adverse possession, you will come to see that my belief that they ought to be granted some legal status is not without some pre-existing precedent in law. Now, to be clear, I think they ought to be granted legal status. I did not say they ought to be granted citizenship. I think whatever legislation it is that grants them legal status specifically denies them the ability to ever become citizens of the United States. They can live here forever, and if they have kids born in the U.S., obviously their offspring would become citizens of the United States by birthright. But I just know that nobody is going to kick out as many as 4 million people. It's just not going to happen, ever. So if we acknowledge that, shouldn't we at least come up with a program where they can be here legally? Where they can work legally? Where they can pay taxes legally? Why keep them in the shadows? It just makes no sense to me. And I said that during the border wall fight during the Trump administration. I said at the time that President Trump should offer to legalize the Dreamers in exchange for his border wall. I think there's a pretty decent chance the Democrats would have gone along with that. They really wanted those Dreamers to be legalized. Trump could have offered that in exchange for a legitimate, secure barrier at the border. Unfortunately, he didn't, probably because he thought the political price would be too high. I wish I could go into it in more detail, but we are out of time. But I appreciate you listening today to The Mike Bates Show. I'm Mike Bates.